The funeral home held 40 folding chairs, and only 6 of them were filled. I sat in the front row in my dress uniform, staring at the flag draped over my husband's casket, listening to my mother-in-law tell the funeral director, loud enough for the whole room to hear, that I didn't belong in that seat. She was never really family, Diane Kensington said, straightening her black gloves like she was correcting a stain on them. Caleb's family sits up front. She can sit wherever she wants. In the back. I didn't move. I'd buried enough friends to know that grief makes people cruel in ways they'll regret later. So I let it go. I folded my hands over my lap and I looked straight ahead at the casket, at the man I married 4 years ago in a courthouse in Jacksonville. And I told myself it didn't matter what she thought of me. I had learned a long time ago how to sit still while people said terrible things over my head, like I wasn't in the room at all. Then the doors at the back of the room opened, and the room went cold in a different way. 20 men in Marine Corps dress blues walked in 2 by 2, boots striking the floor in perfect rhythm, and at the front of them walked a full-bird colonel, with a chest full of ribbons I recognized from every deployment Caleb had ever whispered about in his sleep. He stopped at the edge of the front row. He looked at Diane Kensington first, then at me, and he said the words that changed everything that happened after. "Ma'am, with respect, you're in the wrong seat. That's reserved for Gunnery Sergeant Vance's wife, and I intend to make sure everyone in this room knows exactly who that is." ACT-1 Backstory. My name is Naomi Vance. Before I married Caleb, I was Naomi Ellison, and before that, I was just my father's daughter, tagging along to his unit picnics at Fort Benning because my mother died when I was 6, and Walter Ellison didn't know what else to do with a little girl, except bring her everywhere the Army led him. I grew up in base housing, in a world of chain-link fences and reveille playing over loudspeakers at 6 in the morning. I grew up folding flags at other people's funerals before I fully understood what they meant, standing at the edge of graveside services in a black dress 2 sizes too big, watching my father's shoulders square themselves against grief he never let show on his face. My father served 22 years as an infantryman, retired a first sergeant, and spent the rest of his life doing the thing he loved most, which was showing up. He showed up to every school event, every softball game, every terrible piano recital, right up until the cancer took him when I was 24. I still have the last letter he wrote me, tucked into my Bible, the paper gone soft at the folds from how many times I've read it. In it, he told me that the measure of a good life wasn't the medals a person collected, but the people who showed up when it mattered, and that I should never marry a man who couldn't do that. I enlisted 3 years after he died. I told myself it was to honor him, and that was true, but it was also because I didn't know how to build a life that didn't smell like gun oil and mess hall coffee. Civilian life felt like standing on a floor that wasn't quite level. I became a military police soldier, trained at Fort Leonard Wood, and by the time I met Caleb, I was a sergeant stationed at Camp Lejeune, working joint operations with the Marine base next door, running convoy security details that put me shoulder to shoulder with Marines, more often than soldiers from my own branch. Caleb Vance was a gunnery sergeant, an infantry Marine with 12 years in, and a laugh that filled up a room before you even saw him walk into it. He grew up outside Beaufort, South Carolina, the son of a shrimp boat captain who died young from a heart attack out on the water, raised after that by his mother, Diane, who remarried a man named Roger Kensington when Caleb was 14. Roger owned a small marine supply business that sold fuel filters and rigging equipment to fishing operations and, eventually, to a handful of Department of Defense contracts along the coast. Caleb took his stepfather's name in a legal sense, the way some kids do, half out of convenience and half out of hoping it might make him belong somewhere. But by the time I met him, that hope had curdled into something closer to resentment. He told me once, early on, over cheap beer on my apartment balcony, that his mother had never forgiven him for enlisting instead of taking over Roger's business. She wanted a son who'd stay home and inventory boat parts, he said, laughing the way he did when something actually hurt. She got a son who wanted to see the world get better because of something he did in it. I asked him if that bothered him, and he shrugged and said it used to, but he'd stopped waiting for her to be proud of him around the time he made corporal. We got married 18 months after we met, in a courthouse, with 2 witnesses and no family present. Caleb invited his mother. She didn't come, said she had a business trip she couldn't move. He invited his younger half-brother, Grant Kensington, who sent a text back that said, "Have fun playing soldier," and nothing else. I remember Caleb laughing it off in the parking lot afterward, cracking a joke about how at least the courthouse clerk seemed happy for us, but I also remember how quiet he got that night, how he sat outside with a beer he didn't drink, staring at nothing, like he was trying to work out an equation that never balanced. We built a life anyway. Base housing, then a little rental house off post with a yard too small for the dog we got anyway, a scruffy mutt named Biscuit who Caleb swore was part coyote. He deployed twice while we were married, and I deployed once, to a support role that kept me stateside more than overseas, but taught me exactly how long 6 months can stretch when you're waiting on someone. We wrote letters the old-fashioned way because he said emails felt too easy to skim past, and I still have every one of them in a shoebox under our bed, his handwriting getting worse the longer he was gone, like his hand couldn't keep up with what he wanted to say. He'd draw little cartoons in the margins, terrible stick figure versions of Biscuit, just to make me laugh when I opened the envelope. 8 months ago, his unit deployed again, this time to support operations overseas that I'm still not allowed to discuss in detail. He called me the night before he left, and I remember him telling me not to worry, that he had good Marines around him, that he'd be home in time for my birthday. 6 weeks into that deployment, 2 Marines in dress blues knocked on my door at 6:40 in the morning, and I knew before they said a word what they'd come to tell me. I remember the sound of my own front door creaking, and how strange it felt to notice something so small in a moment like that. Gunnery Sergeant Caleb Vance died protecting 3 Marines under his command during an ambush. He was 34 years old. The official notification called it action against hostile forces. His command called it what it was. He threw himself into the position that took the worst of it, and 3 men went home to their families because of what he did in the 90 seconds before he didn't. One of those men, a young lance corporal named Diego, would later write me a letter I couldn't finish reading the first 3 times I tried. I was his legal next of kin. I was his emergency contact, his DD Form 93 designated beneficiary, the name on every piece of paperwork the Marine Corps had on file for him. I planned his funeral, I picked the flag, I chose the words for his headstone, agonizing over them for 2 days, before settling on something simple. Something he would have laughed at for being too sentimental and secretly loved anyway. And when I called his mother to tell her, Diane Kensington's first words to me were, "I always knew this would happen to him because of the life you two chose." Not a question about how he died, not a word about missing him. Just blame, delivered as calmly as a weather report. I should have known then what the funeral would look like. I just didn't want to believe it yet, because some part of me still hoped grief might soften a woman who had never softened for anything in the years I'd known her. There's a version of this story where I could tell you Diane Kensington and I had some falling out, some specific fight that explained the distance between us. That's not the truth. The truth is simpler and somehow worse. She never gave me a chance to be anything other than the woman who took her son somewhere she didn't want him to go. The first time we met, at a diner outside Beaufort 2 months into our relationship, she spent the entire meal asking Caleb questions about Roger's business, about whether he'd thought any more about a real career, while I sat across the table like a stain she was trying not to look at directly. Caleb apologized to me in the truck afterward, and I told him it was fine, because I didn't yet understand that it would never get better, only quieter. He tried, for years, in his own stubborn way. He called her on her birthday even when she let it go to voicemail. He sent her photographs from every duty station, every promotion ceremony, hoping something might land differently than the last thing had. It never did. And somewhere in the space between his hoping and her silence, I learned to stop expecting an invitation to a family that had already decided, long before I arrived, exactly who belonged in it and who didn't. AC2, The Incident. The service was scheduled for 11 o'clock in the morning at Coastal Rest Funeral Home outside Beaufort, close enough to Caleb's childhood home that his mother insisted on it, far enough from Camp Lejeune that most of his unit would have to travel 3 hours to be there. I didn't fight her on the location. I didn't have the energy left to fight anyone on anything by that point. I'd spent the 2 weeks since the notification running on coffee and paperwork, signing forms I couldn't read through tears, listening to casualty assistance officers explain benefits in a voice that stayed gentle no matter how many times I had to ask them to repeat themselves. I arrived at 9:30 to help set up the memorial table, his photos, his medals in a shadow box I'd built myself over 3 sleepless nights, a folded flag I hadn't been given yet because the official flag folding would happen at the graveside. I arranged the photographs in the order of his life, careful and deliberate, the way I imagined he'd have wanted it if he'd ever let himself think about a moment like this one. By 10:15, only a handful of chairs were filled, a few of my own coworkers from the MP company, an elderly neighbor who'd watched Biscuit for us during deployments, 2 Marines from Caleb's old unit who'd rotated out before this last deployment and driven in from out of state the moment they heard. Diane Kensington arrived at 10:20 with Grant and a small cluster of relatives I'd met exactly twice in 4 years of marriage, all of them dressed in expensive black that looked like it had never touched a folding chair before. She walked past me without a word, her heels clicking against the tile in a rhythm that felt deliberately loud, like she wanted the room to notice her entrance more than the man in the casket. At 10:40, the funeral director, a soft-spoken man named Owen Voss, who'd handled the arrangements with more patience than I probably deserved, given how many times I'd changed my mind about the smallest details, approached me with a folded program in his hand and a look on his face that told me something was wrong before he said a word. "Mrs. Vance," he said quietly, leaning close so only I could hear, "Mrs. Kensington has requested the front row be reserved for immediate family only. I wanted to check with you before I moved anyone." I told him I was immediate family. I was his wife. I'd been the one who signed every form, made every call, chosen every word etched into stone that would mark where he rested now. That's when Diane Kensington turned around, loud enough for the room to hear her, and said the marriage wasn't real to her, that Caleb had thrown his life away, on the Marine Corps and on me right along with it, and that she'd be deciding where people sat at her son's funeral, not some woman who married him in a courthouse with no family present. Her voice carried the particular cruelty of someone who has rehearsed a line in private and finally found an audience worth delivering it to. I felt my face go hot. I felt 20 years of military bearing kick in at exactly the moment I needed it most. The same discipline my father had drilled into me without ever meaning to. The kind that lets you stand at attention while something inside you is falling apart. I sat down in the back row without another word, because I refused to turn my husband's funeral into a scene. Refused to give her the satisfaction of watching me lose composure in front of strangers who'd remember it longer than they'd remember him. At 10:52, the doors opened. 20 Marines in dress blues filed in, 2 by 2, boots striking the tile in a cadence that made the small room feel suddenly, impossibly full, and the room went silent in the way rooms go silent when something bigger than everyone in it just walked through the door. At the front of them was a colonel I recognized instantly, because Caleb had talked about him for years. Colonel Adrian Foster, his battalion commander, the man who'd written Caleb's last 2 fitness reports, and who Caleb once said would run through a wall for any Marine in his unit, and expects the same back. Colonel Foster stopped at the front row. He looked at Diane Kensington sitting in the seat she'd claimed, then he looked back at me in the last row, and something in his expression hardened into the kind of quiet authority that doesn't need to be loud to fill a room. "Ma'am," he said to her, "I need you to move. That seat belongs to Gunnery Sergeant Vance's wife." Diane Kensington straightened her spine and told him flatly that there'd been some confusion about the marriage, that she wasn't sure it was even legally valid, that she'd been the one handling the real paperwork with the Marine Corps Casualty Office, as though 4 years of marriage could be undone by the sheer force of her insistence otherwise. Colonel Foster didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "Ma'am, I sat with Naomi Vance in a casualty assistance meeting 11 days ago. I've read the DD Form 93 with my own eyes. There is no confusion on our end." Then he turned, walked the length of the room, and extended his hand to me. "Mrs. Vance, would you please come sit where you belong?" I stood up on legs that didn't feel steady, walked past 20 Marines standing at parade rest, each one nodding to me as I passed like I was someone they'd been waiting to meet, and sat down in the seat that had been mine the entire time. Diane Kensington's face went white, then red, and Grant Kensington muttered something under his breath I didn't catch, something that sounded like an excuse he'd been saving in case anyone ever asked. What I didn't know yet, what I wouldn't learn until later that afternoon, was that Colonel Foster hadn't come only to correct a seating arrangement. He'd come because 2 days earlier, someone in his casualty assistance office had flagged a problem, a piece of paperwork that shouldn't have existed, and it had Diane Kensington's signature on it. I reached out to the only person I could think to call that morning before the service, my father's old friend and my own former first sergeant, a woman named Renata Sullivan, and told her I didn't know how I was going to survive sitting in a room where my husband's own mother had decided I didn't matter. She told me to hold on, that sometimes the truth arrives exactly when you've stopped expecting it to. I want to be honest about something, because this isn't a story where I sat quietly and never doubted myself. In the parking lot before the service started, I sat in my car for 11 minutes with the engine off, staring at the funeral home's brick entrance, wondering if I even had the right to walk in and claim a seat anyone was willing to fight me over. Grief does strange things to a person's sense of what they're owed. I'd spent 6 weeks being told by strangers in official voices that I was next of kin, that I was the beneficiary, that every form had my name on it in ink that couldn't be argued with. And somehow none of that had prepared me for how small one woman's contempt could make all of that paperwork feel. I thought about my father then, sitting in that car, the way I always seem to when I don't know what to do with myself. Like he never met Caleb. He died 11 months before I did. But I remembered something he told me once at my own boot camp graduation, watching other soldiers get hugged by parents who'd flown in from 3 states away while it was just the 2 of us standing near the parking lot afterward. He said the Army had taught him that family isn't a guest list. It's whoever shows up when the weather turns bad. I didn't understand what he meant until I was sitting in that car working up the nerve to walk into a room where the people who shared Caleb's blood had already made it clear they didn't consider me part of anything. I walked in anyway. That's the only part of that morning I'm proud of. ACT 3, The Reckoning. After the service, Colonel Foster asked to speak with me privately in the funeral home's small side office, along with a woman he introduced as Agent Priya Nash from the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. The office smelled like old carpet and coffee that had been sitting too long, and I remember being grateful for a chair because my legs finally gave up whatever composure they'd been holding together. "Mrs. Vance," Colonel Foster said, "I owe you an explanation, and I owe you an apology for the timing of it." He set a folder on the table between us, and I noticed his hands were steady in a way mine hadn't been in weeks. 10 days ago, our Casualty Assistance Office received a form attempting to redirect a portion of your husband's service member's group life insurance benefit. It listed Diane Kensington as an alternate beneficiary, with a signature dated after Caleb's death. I didn't understand at first. My mind was still catching up to the morning, still replaying the sound of Diane's heels on the tile. Agent Nash explained it plainly, the way someone explains a thing they've explained many times before. SGLI beneficiary designations are locked in through the service member's official election on file with the government, and any changes have to come from the service member while alive, not from a grieving relative afterward. Filing a form like that, backdated and unauthorized, isn't a family dispute. It's federal insurance fraud, plain and simple, regardless of how it's dressed up. "We traced the submission," Agent Nash said, sliding a printed page across the table so I could see it myself. It came from a fax machine registered to a business called Kensington Marine Supply, Grant Kensington's stepfather's company, Diane's company, the same company that had, according to records the investigation later uncovered, held small maintenance contracts with 2 Marine Corps installations along the coast for over a decade. Colonel Foster leaned forward, his voice steady and matter-of-fact, the tone of a man laying out something he'd already confirmed a dozen times over. "Mrs. Vance, under Title 38 of the United States Code, SGLI proceeds go to the beneficiary your husband designated. Full stop. That's you. It has always been you. What Mrs. Kensington attempted isn't just wrong. It's a federal crime, and NCIS is going to make sure it's treated as one, regardless of who she believes she is to this family." He told me something else, too. Something Caleb had never mentioned, maybe because he didn't want me to carry the weight of it while he was still deployed. 2 years earlier, after a rotation where Caleb had personally covered fuel and repair costs for 3 junior Marines whose families were struggling back home, quietly, without ever mentioning it to anyone in his chain of command, Colonel Foster had recommended him for the Marine Corps' Meritorious Service designation, an honor that had been sitting, unfinished, in a review process interrupted by his death. Colonel Foster told me he'd spent the last 11 days making sure that recommendation was finalized posthumously, staying late at his own desk working through the paperwork himself rather than delegating it, because he said Caleb deserved to have someone finish what he'd started. Back in the main room, Colonel Foster addressed the small crowd directly. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The 20 Marines standing along the back wall did more to command the room's attention than any raised voice could have. For those who don't know, he said, Gunnery Sergeant Vance is being posthumously awarded the Meritorious Service Medal for actions both in combat and in the quiet ways he took care of the Marines under him. His official next of kin, his designated beneficiary, and the woman who has every legal and moral claim to sit in that front row is his wife, Naomi Vance. I'd ask everyone in this room to treat her accordingly, today and going forward. Diane Kensington tried to interrupt, insisting the insurance matter was a misunderstanding between family, her voice climbing toward the same performance she'd given earlier, but this time, nobody in the room seemed inclined to let her finish. Agent Nash stepped forward and, calmly, without a hint of drama in her voice, informed her she'd need to answer some questions at the NC's field office regarding the fraudulent SGLI submission, and that any further contact regarding the estate should go through legal counsel rather than through me directly. Grant Kensington's face went the color of old paper. Neither of them said another word for the rest of the service, and by the time the small crowd filed out toward the cars for the graveside portion, the two of them were standing apart from everyone else, not speaking even to each other. I stood at the graveside an hour later, while Marines folded the flag 13 times into a tight triangle, each fold sharp and precise, the way Caleb had once shown me himself on our kitchen table, half as a joke and half because he liked that I wanted to learn it. Colonel Foster knelt in front of me and placed it in my hands the way it's supposed to be done, on behalf of a grateful nation, on behalf of the Corps, on behalf of every man who came home because Caleb didn't. I held it against my chest, and, for the first time since the two Marines had knocked on my door 6 weeks earlier, I let myself cry in front of other people. Before everyone left the cemetery, one of the younger Marines, a corporal I didn't recognize, approached me hesitantly, twisting his cover in his hands like he wasn't sure he had the standing to speak to me at all. He told me his name was Marcus, that he'd been 18 years old and terrified out of his mind on the day of the ambush, and that Gunny Vance had been the one who dragged him behind cover before going back for the others. He said he hadn't slept a full night since it happened, and that he'd driven 6 hours that morning because he needed to look the wife of the man who saved his life in the eye at least once. I didn't have words for him. I just took his hand and told him that was exactly the kind of thing Caleb would have wanted to know mattered. Colonel Foster stayed until the last car pulled out of the gravel lot. Before he left, he handed me his direct line, told me that anything I needed from the Marine Corps going forward, anything at all, I was to call him personally rather than go through a general casualty office line. Gunnery Sergeant Vance's family doesn't wait in a queue, he said. Not on my watch. It was a small thing, a business card and a phone number, but it was the first time in 6 weeks that anyone connected to Caleb's world had treated me like I belonged to it, without needing to be convinced first. ACT 4. After 6 weeks later, I got a call from Agent Nash. Diane Kensington had been formally charged with attempted federal insurance fraud, and rather than fight it in court, she'd accepted a plea agreement, a felony conviction, a $12,000 fine, and 3 years of probation. Kensington Marine Supply lost its Department of Defense contractor registration entirely, a business relationship that had supplied fuel filters and rigging hardware to 2 Marine Corps installations for 11 years, gone in a single afternoon because Grant Kensington had let his mother use the company fax machine for something neither of them thought anyone would ever trace back to them. The SGLI benefit, all $500,000 of it, was released to me in full within 90 days, exactly the way it should have been from the beginning, without a single additional form standing between me and what Caleb had already decided, years earlier, belonged to his wife. 3 months after the funeral, I stood in a formation at Camp Lejeune while Colonel Foster pinned new rank on my collar. I'd been selected for promotion to staff sergeant, a board result that had nothing to do with what happened at the funeral, and everything to do with 8 years of work I'd put in long before anyone knew my husband's name. But he made a point of shaking my hand afterward and telling me that Caleb would have been unbearable about it, grinning the whole ceremony, probably embarrassing me in front of everyone by hollering something inappropriate from the back row. The Meritorious Service Medal arrived in a wooden display case 4 months after the funeral, delivered in person by 2 Marines from Caleb's old unit, the same 2 who'd first shown up early on the day of the service, who told me, almost sheepishly, standing on my front porch with Biscuit barking at their boots, that they'd started a tradition without asking me first. Every year, on the anniversary of the ambush, they were going to come to my house, the same day, the same time, and sit with me for an hour. No speeches, no ceremony, just showing up, the way Caleb always did for them, the way my own father had taught me a good life gets measured. I still have his letters in the shoebox under our bed, the little cartoon drawings of Biscuit fading slightly where the ink has started to run. I still have my father's last letter tucked into my Bible, the one that told me never to marry a man who couldn't show up. And now I have a folded flag on the mantle, a medal in a case beside it, and a photograph of Caleb laughing at something off camera, taken 2 weeks before he died, that I look at every morning before I put my uniform on, and pin my own rank into place. Diane Kensington has reached out twice since the sentencing, asking to talk. I haven't answered either message yet. Some things take longer than a courtroom to settle, and I've learned I don't owe anyone forgiveness on a schedule that suits them better than it suits me. Last month, Lance Corporal Diego, one of the 3 Marines Caleb died protecting, drove 4 hours to meet me in person for the first time. He didn't say much. He just handed me a folded piece of paper with a list of everything he'd done since coming home, finishing community college, proposing to his girlfriend, naming their first child after a man he'd known for 11 months. I keep that list next to Caleb's letters now. It felt like the last piece of the story I didn't know I was still waiting for. I think about the funeral home a lot, more than I probably should. Not the front row, not Diane Kensington's voice carrying across the room, but the moment right before the doors opened, when I was sitting alone in the back thinking that this was simply how it would be. That grief comes with a bill nobody warns you about, and mine was going to be paid in humiliation nobody else in that room would ever have to answer for. I think about how close I came to believing that was the end of the story. That composure was the only thing I had left to offer anyone. What I've come to understand since is that showing up isn't only what the living do for each other. Caleb showed up for 3 Marines in the worst 90 seconds of his life, and because of that, 20 more of them showed up for me before I even knew I needed them to. Colonel Foster didn't have to walk the length of that room. Agent Nash didn't have to drive 3 hours to a funeral home to deliver news that could have waited a week. Lance Corporal Diego didn't have to spend 4 hours on the road to hand a stranger a folded piece of paper. They all chose to anyway, the same way my father chose every school recital, the same way Caleb chose the Marines under his command over his own safety without a second of hesitation. Some nights, I still set the table for 2 out of habit before I remember. Biscuit still waits by the door around 5 in the evening, the exact time Caleb used to come home, and I've stopped trying to explain to a dog why that stopped happening. Grief doesn't leave on a schedule, but it does, eventually, make room for something else to sit beside it. Gratitude, mostly, and the strange, steady comfort of knowing that the people who mattered most to him never stopped treating me like I mattered too. If this story moved you, I want to hear one word from you in the comments, the word that describes what family should actually mean to you. Not blood, not paperwork, showing up. Naomi didn't need anyone to fight her battles for her. She'd already spent years learning how to stand her ground in silence. But sometimes, the people who love us most show up not to save us, but to make sure the truth finally gets said out loud, in a room full of people who needed to hear it whether they wanted to or not. And if this story reminded you that family is something you build, not something you're born into, subscribe, because tomorrow, I am telling you about the Navy corpsman who was denied a hospital visit to see her dying father, until a 4-star admiral showed up at the front desk asking why. I'll see you there.